Welcome to the Adrian Tan Show. This is my podcast where I have deep conversations with the people who are enabling organizations to become ready for the future of work. My guests include a mindfulness coach, the folks behind Singapore's most popular investment app, and many more. They all have one thing in common, and that is to level up your organizations through your people. I'm very happy that today, Brett Potter is able to shed more light on this elusive item called the company culture. He's an expert in company culture development who is consulted by companies and leaders worldwide to help design, develop, and build high-performing cultures. He's a CEO of CultureGene, a culture leadership software and services platform. Prior to founding CultureGene, Brett spent 16 years as the managing partner of a leading executive search firm based in London and working with startups and high-growth companies in the UK, Europe, and USA. In 2018, he published his first book, Culture Decks Decoded, and his second one, Own Your Culture: How to Define, Embed, and Manage Your Company Culture, and that's the book that we're going to be touching on. I just completed reading the book, and it's really a fascinating read to find out the extent that companies' owners actually go to ensure that people not just remember the culture, but they live the culture and breathe the culture. Please welcome my guest, Brett Potter. Hey, Brett, thank you for coming on to the show.
Adrian, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to our session.
Likewise, I just finished your book, by the way. It's an awesome book. There's so many different examples, and some of it really blew me away. But before we touch on them and to find out more about your experience speaking with all these different companies, CEOs, to learn more about their culture, could you help us to understand what motivated you to write this book to begin with?
Yeah, so I realized about 5.5 years ago now that culture was the missing link for most companies. And I decided that I didn't know terribly much at all about company culture. So I decided to really do a deep dive and research and understand company culture. And part of that was just starting to interview CEOs of high growth companies that have effectively defined, embedded, and managed their culture well. And so I started blogging about those interviews. And then I decided, you know what, I did just over 50 interviews. And I decided there is definitely a book in this because there's an opportunity to, I felt, write a tactical book about culture where most books are much more strategic in nature.
And in the book, you also mentioned, based on the correspondence you have with all the CEO, you came to realize there's actually five archetypes of CEOs. Could you elaborate for us what are those five archetypes and how do they differ?
Yeah, so I came to realize that first of all, I had to speak to over 500 companies to be able to interview just over 50 CEOs. And I realized that there are these five archetypes. There is the culture agnostic, not interested, doesn't care, doesn't even want to know about it, is just going to drive the business their way. There's the tick box, will do some work on the values, mission, and vision, and then completely forget about it and tick the box. Then there is the CEO that has done some work on company culture. They've dipped their toe in the water, and they may have done some work on values and mission and vision, but that's pretty much it. They've tried some stuff and it hasn't worked, but they understand that company culture is important. They understand that there is this tremendous advantage to developing a strong culture. They just don't know what to do. And then the fourth type is the culture aware, the CEO who really gets it. They've worked in a strong company culture before. They have experience or just a natural instinct for the importance and how to develop company culture. And the fifth CEO is the CEO that's waking up to the realization with this pandemic of how important company culture is. And they previously were culture agnostic, but they're now thinking, wow, things are not, I'm struggling to keep my invisible, subconscious, intangible culture together. I need to do some work on it now. So those are the five.
It occurred to me after your description that I may fall under, or I fell into the tick box CEO when I was still running my own business. Just trying to put some statement out there, make sure I have some text on the wall, and then that's it. We don't really care. But beyond just having a value, mission, vision, it definitely means we still have to go beyond it, to start practicing it, what are some of the practices that you believe CEO has to do or companies have to do in order to live and breathe all these values?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The company culture is this complex, amorphous thing that happens below the surface. It's mainly invisible, subconscious, and intangible. And the best CEOs make it visible, conscious, and tangible. And the way to do that is to embed your culture. And when we work with clients, we work with clients to embed at a leadership team level, at a functional level, and a process level. There are only 6 ways to embed company culture. And those 6 ways are how you reward and recognize, what you measure and pay attention to, where you invest and allocate your resources, how you train, mentor, and educate, how you behave in crisis or difficult situations, and how you hire, fire, and promote. So let me just give you a quick example. If you're the CEO of a company and you say, our customer support is really important. It's critical to us. One of our values is to wow the customer. But then when the customer service team come to you and say, we need some software for customer service to be better, and you instead buy software for sales, they realize that you don't really mean what you say. If you don't invest in training and mentoring and educating the customer support team, they realize you don't mean what you say. If you don't recognize and reward the customer support team for their good work, they realize they don't mean what you say. So it doesn't matter what you say. Those 6 embedding mechanisms are critical, which I think is chapter 8 in my book, are critical to embedding and really getting people to live and breathe and model the values and the culture and the behaviors you want to drive.
And how much of this would be from hiring, and how much of this will be from trying to, well, for lack of a better term, brainwash into their head for them to live the same values as what you have created?
So this is really important. Most people try to hire for culture fit. And I believe that culture fit is impossible to hire for. It's because most people can't describe their culture. So how can you hire for it? So actually what you've got to hire for is values fit. And if you hire for values fit, then you shouldn't have too much of a problem embedding this. And it's not really about brainwashing, because brainwashing means that you are almost trying to build a cult, which means that you are brainwashing people into not thinking, not using independent thought. And as a leader, you actually want people to use their independent thought, because that's where the magic and the innovation and the creativity and the adaptability is going to come from. So what you really want to do is hire against the values of you, your founders, your team, and the culture of the business, because then it's like swimming downstream versus swimming upstream into the current.
I love the example they've given, swimming downstream rather than swimming upstream against all the resistance as well as the heavy water. And I like the fact that you mentioned it is really trying to walk the talk, to present across to people that you are actually living all these values. And
Yeah.
some of the examples that I'm seeing in the book is really amazing. I've read about a company, Influative. They threaten to fire people if they do not take 3 weeks of vacation, and many other interesting things that they are doing. Among all these different examples, given that you've spoken with 50 CEOs, interviewed more than 500 companies, what surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most is well, actually, not really. Firstly, was how rarely giving the CEOs were. The CEOs who have invested in their culture spent a lot of time with me. You mentioned Influative, that CEO of that company is actually the founder of that company is a guy named Mark Organ. And Mark gave me 3 hours of his time, and he's a busy guy, but he wanted to just pay it forward. So that was the first thing. The second thing was how much CEOs are thinking about their culture. The best CEOs are almost at a level where it becomes a function in their business. They are thinking about it, every single day, regularly. They actually evaluate their decisions against the values of the business. And to give you an example of the little things that make a difference, in the book I interviewed a lady named Alethea Navarro, who was the founder of Skimlinks. And Alethea, when they'd raised enough money to actually design their offices, she actually had put the kitchen pretty much central in the office and put a toaster in the kitchen, because she said to me, she said, you know that smell when you have the smell of toast in your in your home, that's a very homely smell. It's an early morning safe, just a great feeling, great feeling from that smell. And she wanted people to feel safe and people to feel comfortable and people to feel like they were sitting down to breakfast with their family in their culture. So these little examples of what CEOs who are really, really thinking about this do are what surprised me about the way they operate.
And for companies that are trying to look into this, many of them may also struggle to learn how to start because, as you've also written in the book, if you try to ask 50 people, what does culture means to you? Few of them could even come back to you with a good answer. So for companies that have accepted, okay, culture is the way to go, but they are clueless in this space, what's the first step do you think they should do?
So I'm going to sound a little bit biased here, but I recommend they read my book. But in the book, actually, the first two chapters pretty much talk about how important company culture is, what it is, and how much of an asset it is to a business if you do build a strong and functional culture. And chapter 3 is really about defining values. And so your culture is this culture develops over time, and you as the founder and your team learn about what works over time, and so your culture forms over time. It ultimately is this fairly random combination of good and bad behaviors, norms, principles, communication styles, processes, procedures. It's the way we do things around here. But a key element of that is your values. You need a vision and mission so that you've got the why and the what we do to get the why. And the values are your how. How are we going to behave? How are we going to operate to make this work? And those values are in us. They're our DNA. My values were set by my parents, by my upbringing, by how I've grown as a person, and what I've learned along the way about what's right and wrong. And you need to find people that, first of all, define those values and understand what those values mean to you, and then find people who match those values. So for me, the first step, the real DNA of the culture is well defined values. And that's not just aspirational values. That's not just, we want to be candid when you can't be candid. It's about the balance of stretch aspiration but also reality. These are my values right now. This is what I stand for right now.
It seems to me, in terms of culture building, a lot of it would be based on observations of things that are being done and things that are not being done. In today's context, when we are in this pandemic situation and many people are on remote working arrangements, how would that impact or affect the way companies attempt to build or reinforce their culture?
Yeah, so that's a great question in this current environment. What I'm finding is companies that did work on their culture pre-COVID are finding it a much easier transition than companies that relied on their offices to build their culture and maintain their culture for them. What we don't realize is that in the office we took a lot for granted. We took osmosis, we took visibility, we took availability, we took informal communication, we took the ease of feedback, the ease of brainstorming, the ease of connecting, the ease of having those water cooler moments. We took that for granted as part of our culture. And now that those things are no longer available, the companies that didn't work on their culture pre-COVID are definitely finding this harder. So the most important thing to do, and in chapter 12 of my book, I talk about the 9 best practices of remote work. What I recommend companies do is look at the remote work companies that are successful and understand what it is that they do, because you're always going to have a portion of your company remote now. Most companies are going to go into some sort of a hybrid model, which means that you may have people working, in different places around the world, but even in your city, people are going to want more flexibility. And you have to build the capability to work in a remote way with people when they are working remotely. So for me, it's about social connection. We're really struggling now because we don't use enough asynchronous communication, which means we use too much Zoom, we use too much Slack, we're synchronous communication. And that's burning people out, which means that people don't want to spend another hour on a video call having Friday afternoon drinks or that kind of thing. So, really, this is looking at these 9 best practices, documentation, defining and documenting processes and the associated documentation is critical. Moving more of your communication from synchronous to asynchronous, where people can respond within a certain period of time. Transitioning from a speak first mentality to a write first mentality, and then building on clever ways of creating micro communities, which allows the social connection to be less hard to do in bigger organizations. So it's actually, if you think about it, pre-COVID we had an office-based culture where we relied on our office to build our culture and maintain our culture. During the pandemic, we are now pretty much fully remote, and we're learning and struggling because people are getting burnt out. People are getting, they're overburdened with work because we have too many meetings during the day, and that means we have to work at night to make up for all the meetings that we shouldn't have participated in, or didn't need to participate in, or shouldn't have even happened in the first place. And then we're going to move to a hybrid culture. And so leaders, the best leaders, are actually adapting to this right now, are trying to get ahead of what does a hybrid culture mean to our environment, and how do we build that now?
That's good to know that during even such environment, we are able to continue with building culture or even consider looking into building our culture within our company. I would like to flip the discussion over to the talent side. So as much as I understand from what you shared earlier on, it would be impossible or hard to hire for the same culture and instead to hire for value. As a job seeker, would it actually make sense for me to identify aspects which may resonate more with me, and how should I go about doing so to ensure that whatever they put down on the wall are actually things that the company is practicing?
Yeah, so there are a couple of dimensions to being a job seeker right now. The first one is around values, and I would first of all understand what my values are. So I'd go through an exercise of saying what's important to me: honesty, integrity, transparency. What are the words that spring to mind that are really critical for me to really want to work and be myself and fulfill my potential? So what's important for me? And then when you interview with a company, you can ask the same question of everybody you interview. So for me, the clever thing is to design 3 or 4 questions that allow you to get consistency or inconsistency. So I would ask everybody I interviewed with to describe the culture. What is the culture? How, could you describe your culture to me, please? I'd ask them why they joined the company. I'd ask them if they could change one thing about the company right now, what would they change? And I would ask them whether they feel that I am a good fit with their values or not. And if you ask each person you interview with, you'd either get the same answers, which means there is a strong culture and you should consider it, or you'll get inconsistent answers where you need to really think about this culture twice. You must remember that you can push these people fairly hard with your questioning, because they ultimately don't want to lie to you. And if they don't have a culture that is strong and functional that they feel you would fit into, then they will probably tell you, or they're going to work with you for the next 2 years and you're going to hate them because you lied to them. They lied to you. So that's the first element, is around the values. The second element that I would be focusing on right now, if I was somebody looking for employment, would be to ask how the company is adapting to remote work. What are they doing to make sure that if I'm in a hybrid situation and I'm working from home 2 days or 3 days a week, or I'm actually fully remote, what is the infrastructure? What have they done to build a fully remote or a remote first hybrid environment where I don't end up feeling like a second class citizen when I'm working remote? Those are the two elements that I would be focusing to evaluate companies on right now.
Thank you so much for your advice. I'm very certain this will be very much appreciated by any job seekers listening to this podcast. And lastly, given that I'm interviewing you from Singapore, which is in Southeast Asia, based on your research and based on your understanding, would culture building cut across different organizations, different countries, different segments of the world, given that in Asia, you of course have, well, many different cultures. You have the Japanese culture, you have the Korean culture, which might be a bit top down, and in Singapore, a bit more cosmopolitan. Are there such things that we should take account into, or things that you believe would actually play a larger part in how we build a culture around this part of the world?
So in Europe we have the French people, we have German people, we have the English people, and we've got everything in between as well with Middle East and Eastern Europe. Culture, there is a country culture, so there is a national culture, and the French are different to the Germans, who are different to the English, who are different to the Swiss, and in the same way the Chinese are different to the Japanese, different to the Koreans, different to the Singaporeans. But within those national cultures, there are individual people who have values, and those values may overlap significantly with the culture. So French culture is typically very hierarchical, and if you are building a hierarchical culture, then that's fine. But you just need to know what culture you're building. If you know Japan, I can generalize, but if you are building that type of culture in Japan, or you're building a more open culture in Singapore, as long as you know what you're building and you hire for those values, it doesn't matter where you are. You could be on the moon.
Right. So it's really being true to yourself and not trying to, in a way, fake it till you make it kind of situation, or to try to create a facade of what you're trying to be when you're truly not. And that is definitely something companies would want to identify, really have a good clarity on how you want to behave and how you want to infuse those values into your company. And I'm here speaking with Bretton, the author of Own Your Culture: How to Define, Embed, and Manage Your Company Culture. Thank you so much, Brett, for making time for this podcast. I know you're on a podcast run, and this is your 52nd one. So I hope more to come, and for you to spread the word out about your book as well as your teachings to more companies for them to drive their culture.
Adrian, my pleasure. Thanks very much, and continue the great work you're doing as well.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. You can refer to the show notes for links to more information about our guests and their businesses. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would be helpful to give a review on iTunes or follow me on Spotify. If you're using Overcast, please hit the star button under the episode. That will help get this episode and podcast out to more people who may find it useful. I'll see you in the next episode of The Adrian Tan Show.